Hi everyone, I'm Chris Wright and welcome to Right on the Nail. This is in fact the first of a new series of Right on the Nail, so I'm really excited that you're able to join us. I'm going to have a marvellous conversation about some of the really super important issues that are going on in the world today. And I'm joined by three super important people to discuss those issues. I'm joined by Labour member of the London Assembly for Merton and Wandsworth since 2016, Leonie Cooper. Leonie, do you include Wimbledon in your area as well?
I do include Wimbledon amongst
So
many.
you're involved with the development of the golf course and that kind of thing there as well?
I've had quite a lot to do with that, yes.
Yes, I'm sure you have. And we're also joined once again by a reasonably regular contributor to Right on the Nail in Jean-Monnet, Professor of European Integration at the National University of Ireland, Maynooth, John O'Brennan. And John is an expert on all things European and perhaps an expert on all things non-European also. And finally, former longtime editor of the Sunday Mirror, Nigel Nelson. So, where are we going to start? Let's start straight away by talking about Rachel Reeves, the financial statement, the spring statement, which came out this week, and the fact that she prefaced all of this by blaming any changes on world events that have been significant since the last budget in the autumn. What do we think of the statement? What do we think about how she is dealing with things in general? And to what extent is she right to blame world events? John.
Well, Chris, firstly, I think we should acknowledge that Rachel Reeves inherited a terrible economy. A lot of the things I suspect that she and Starmer and their colleagues might like to do, they just cannot do because they are hemmed in by the financial situation. It's incredibly different to 1997, where the then new Labour government actually had a growing economy. And over time, they were able to use that growth to increase spending on the NHS in particular and social care and lots of other areas. Reeves just cannot do that. But even allowing for the economic emasculation, I can understand why people on the left in Britain are deeply upset with her and Starmer. I'm a very boring European social democrat, so I'm very sympathetic to Labour arguments in the UK. I cannot understand for the life of me why they seem to think that the burden of adjustment, and remember, this will be the third big phase of austerity imposed on Britain since 2010, that the burden has to be borne by those who are actually least able to carry that burden. And once again, the opportunity to introduce a wealth tax, and there is phenomenal wealth in Britain as there are in neighbouring countries in Europe, has made absolutely no impact on the Chancellor and the Prime Minister. We know that tens of billions of pounds could be raised by a wealth tax if only the politicians were brave enough to take this on. Instead, they're looking at some of the most vulnerable people in Britain, about 3 million households or so, who are going to see their benefits reduced significantly. And I can't help thinking that this is yet another missed opportunity to try and tackle this chronic problem of inequality in Britain. It's going to get worse rather than better. And I think Labour could well bear the price of this politically in the years to come, because the only people who are going to benefit from this is Reform UK. I think in the months to come, you're going to see their numbers probably go back up, even allowing for the internecine difficulties they've had. Such will be the impact, I think, on core Labour support of these cuts when they fall.
Well, I'd like to hear what Leonie thinks of that, obviously, but isn't it just the same old story that, you know, we've got a struggling economy. We have an over-bloated welfare system. We can't afford the over-bloated welfare system unless we can fund it. So to fund it, we need taxes. But if you raise taxes, you have a negative impact on growing the economy. And if you continue to raise taxes, then you might also have a problem with another part of society as well, with business in general. And you need business support. So you're trying to drive a very thin line between both of these issues. And I can't see I mean, she's got terrible press for what she's come up with, but I can't see what she could have come up with that would have avoided her getting terrible press. Leonie, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a pretty thankless job that she's taken on. I think John set out very well the inheritance. I know there's been a lot of people saying, oh, there wasn't really a black hole. Well, there clearly was, that the Conservatives weren't talking about during the general election campaign. And they did all those mad things like, oh, let's reduce national insurance payments, where there was absolutely no justification for that. And of course, they'd left a few things completely out of their spend totals, like, you know, the cost of people in hotels, which is about half of the black hole, so called. So, you know, it was very difficult for her from the instant that she walked over the threshold of the Treasury. And so she's been trying to find this way that you mentioned between, you know, how do I reduce expenditure? How do I increase income? And of course, everything that she does, somebody is going to criticise. The Office of Budget Responsibility have been interesting about where they lay the blame for the issue. Because obviously the Shadow Chancellor yesterday was saying it's all her fault. But actually the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, said it was 75% down to international changes and being buffeted by strong global winds, which I'm sure we will come on to. Did say that some of it is down to some of the changes that she's made. But if you look at what the Bank of England has done, since Labour came in July, they've actually cut interest rates 3 times. Now, businesses have been talking a lot about the problems of some of the changes around national insurance and when employers' national insurance kicks in, and also the changes to employers' national insurance. Not mentioning quite as often that obviously it's a massive bonus for businesses not to have to pay such high interest rates. And so we are still, and I do understand why, you know, she and others in government say we're still getting over the Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng mini budget that caused interest rates to go up. And I think, whilst I hear what John says about there will be angst, I think the fact that NHS waiting lists have been coming down 5 months in a row is a really good thing. And I think the changes to employment, which are going to be really good for working people, especially those in the lower paid jobs, getting rid of fire and rehire, you know, getting rid of, you know, 0 hours contracts, all of these things. And I do think there is an issue that we do need to face up to, which is why do we now have 1 in 8 young people between 18 and 24 not in employment, education or training?
I mean, that is the big issue, because
that's huge.
People are aware of this, and it makes it, you know, people are aware of this. So with what John's saying about, you know, tax the rich, sure. I mean, you can't tax poor people that can't afford to pay any tax. There's nothing more they can give. Nigel, I mean, she gets such a bad press, and you know, we all know her nickname, which, you know, I find a little bit unnecessary, really. It's Rachel from accounts. I mean, it's, you know, it's not really a nice thing to hear people say. It's like, you know, she gets a bad press. Does she deserve the bad press? And what should she have done that she didn't do? And where do we go from here with all of this?
Well, I mean, the big problem, Chris, is that Rachel Reeves got herself into a corner with the election manifesto. So she's promised not to raise the big taxes, income tax, VAT, employee national insurance, which means she has to try and raise the money by hitting small groups of people. That has a political backlash, and we've seen it from the farmers, you've seen it from business, but she's run out of options about where she can actually go to get the money. Now, I tend to agree with John that the one area which she hasn't touched yet, but she could, is the wealthy with a wealth tax. Now, was she to add a 2% tax on the 20,000 people in Britain who are worth more than £10 million? That would solve all her problems, because she'd raise about £400 million a week in extra taxes. Labour don't want to do that because it looks bad as far as business is concerned. But she is running out of those options, and then we've got the problems with defence spending. Now, she's spending another couple of billion a year on defence to try and get towards the 2.5% by 2027. but we're going to need more than that. So if you're looking at the 2030s, we're talking about 3% on defence. That's what Mark Rutte wants at NATO. That would cost 18 billion. If you go as far as 3.5%, which is what the US spends, then we hit 35 billion. All she's managed to do through this spring statement is whack in about £10 billion of headroom. None of that's going to cover it. So somewhere along the line, something big has got to happen, and we haven't seen it yet.
But the danger is that if, and I agree with you. I mean, poor people can't find money they haven't got to pay tax. If it's impossible, rich people have more money, they can pay more tax. But the danger is that they leave the country and don't pay any tax at all. And there are the figures that we see about of high income earners leaving the country. It is quite worrying. And if you get to the point where you do tax people like that, they're the ones that can easily get on a plane and go and live elsewhere. And a lot of people are doing that. So there's a danger in that as well. So it's difficult. And then do people buy into the fact that this is caused by international events like Trump, is obviously what we're talking about. And what about the elephant that's still in the room of Brexit and the fact that it's difficult trading with Europe? Can we ever get the economy going unless we address that situation so we can trade more clearly and more easily with Europe? And is that something that they're just too afraid to grasp?
I think it's absolutely the case. Were Britain inside the European Union, Rachel Reeves would have a lot more options. If you look at the analysis that's been done, Brexit is costing the UK because of these newly erected barriers to trade with the countries that it does most of its trade with, up to £100 billion a year. That's an extraordinary sum relative to the kind of sums we've been talking about that the Chancellor has been trying to reconcile. So this is not going to change, Chris. There's going to be a suppression of the UK's growth for many years to come, precisely because of the decision to erect new barriers to trade, where they had been coming down for about 50 years with Britain's closest neighbours. And all of this is about to get much worse, including for those neighbours next week when Trump introduces the 25% tariffs. What's going to happen, for example, to the UK car industry? The United States is, I think, the largest market for UK automobile manufacturers, and they've now got to face this 25% extra charge. That's going to lead, I think, to an even more suppression of growth, and it's reflected in other products in neighbouring countries. For Ireland, the big concern, for example, is pharmaceutical products. We have a vast overpresence of American multinationals that manufacture drugs in Ireland for sale largely in the United States, and Trump seems determined to bring them back. So we're all wrestling with the same kinds of problems, but we can say, I think with some clarity, Brexit has not made it any easier for any UK Chancellor to balance the books.
Why is it impossible for someone to say that? Is it a sacred cow? Is it too dangerous with the people in the red wall seats up north that were the main proponents of Brexit? And why are we in a situation with a failing economy, if we can't reverse it, that the person that's going to benefit from that is going to be Nigel Farage, who caused Brexit in the first place?
Yeah, I think Leonie will have much better insight into Labour thinking about this, but I think it's very evident that neither Starmer nor Reeves is prepared to grasp the nettle, because it would require this 180-degree turn, and it would require everybody admitting that the whole thing has been a catastrophe. And I don't think they want to go there.
No, they don't, do they? Leonie, what's the feeling inside the government and the Labour Party about this?
I think it's really difficult, though. Nigel just referred earlier on to what was in the Labour manifesto, which made this promise not to raise income tax, national insurance or VAT. And of course, there was nothing in the Labour manifesto that said we are going to reverse Brexit, we're going to negotiate access to the single market, we're going to negotiate getting back into the customs union, or anything like that at all. So I think that, however strongly, and, and I'm on the London Assembly, and I was elected just a few weeks before Brexit happened, and it was voted down by London, it was voted down by Scotland. There are whole tracts of the country where it was voted down, but it was obviously popular in other parts of the country. Even then, the vote was still very balanced between those in favour and those against. But at the moment, it is a settled discussion within the Labour Party. However many Labour members may be very strongly in favour of rejoining the EU, most of us know that it's not something the party is prepared to consider. I think it's far more likely that they might look, and that might be something that would come in the autumn budget, at looking at some other taxes which may not be called a wealth tax, but would address where wealth lies. So, for example, a capital gains tax might be something that they might consider. And obviously, capital gains have been something that some people in this country have made massive capital gains, or an inheritance tax, and looking at the arrangements for inheritance tax and maybe rethinking those, because neither of those at the moment, I think, work properly to tax people who are making huge amounts of money from capital gains or inheritance in certain parts of the country only.
There was a feeling even with the last government that they might be raising capital gains tax, and they didn't. And I do think that's probably the softer option to go for. But Nigel, do you think we're getting to a point, we've talked briefly about the EU, I don't think we're going to be rejoining the EU as such, but we could be forging closer relationships and getting closer to the customs union and the single market, doing something like that, which rejoining fully the EU, I just can't see anyone's going to do that. But are we as a country being placed in a situation by what's going on in Washington that we have to choose between either aligning ourselves entirely with Donald Trump or aligning ourselves with Brussels? Can we really continue to straddle this very, very sharp knife edge that we're trying to do right now? And this applies not just to tariffs and duties, but also as to where we are with the whole situation in the Ukraine. We all saw and we'll talk about the leaks in a minute, but the feeling of this government is very, very, very anti-Europe, anti-EU. Where does Britain sit on that? And is it just good enough to say, come and have a state visit with the king and everything's going to be all right? Is that going to wash with Trump? Is he going to treat us differently? Or is he going to treat us basically the same as everybody else?
Well, the trouble with Trump is he's completely unpredictable. So we don't really know the answer to that question. Certainly what Keir Starmer is trying to do is walk the middle ground between Europe and America. You can see he's going out of his way not to say anything bad about a very thin-skinned American president. And what he's trying to do with Europe is to get a reset to improve our trade relations. The idea of reversing Brexit is just not on the cards. I was a Remainer, but I accept that the decision's been made. And frankly, there's nothing we can do about it, or certainly not in our lifetime. Now, whether or not, your point, Chris, whether or not Keir Starmer can successfully do that without picking a side is going to be very difficult. Clearly, at the moment, while the tariffs are a bit up in the air, Keir Starmer will carry on trying to suck up to Donald Trump in the hope of avoiding them. What will happen if we can't avoid them is a different matter, because we may end up, it's pretty certain that Europe won't be able to avoid them. We may be in that situation where we will have to side with Europe against America. But at the moment, until we actually know what Trump is going to do, it's very difficult to predict what else Keir Starmer can do than otherwise try and tread this middle ground.
Well, let's just go straight on from there to Ukraine and what's happening with Ukraine. Clearly, Donald Trump came in on a manifesto promise that he'd end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. We're now 3 months into his presidency, and we're no closer to ending it, really, are we? Unless you just give in to Russia and say you can have whatever you want. And meanwhile, whilst Trump's taking this view, we've got a meeting in Paris with Starmer and the heads of the major European countries, figuring out how we are going to protect Ukraine. So we've also we've also got a very clear message from Washington that NATO is effectively finished. There is effectively no such thing as NATO anymore. So in terms of the economic side and the trade policy side, that's one thing. But in terms of defense, it's almost like we're no longer part of what America's doing, and we're part of what Europe's doing. So that decision has been made for us. Is that right, John?
Yes, I think that's absolutely accurate. It has been astonishing to me to watch the party of Ronald Reagan not just pivot away from the UK and Europe, but has expressly allied itself now with Putin's Russia. Remember Reagan's comment about the Soviet Union in the 90s, that it was the evil empire. Well, this is an equally evil, brutal, predatory empire. And Trump and Putin are in absolute lockstep. They hate Europe for different reasons, I think. And I think they are both intent on achieving the destruction and breakup of the European Union, amongst other objectives. So it is deeply, deeply worrying what's been happening. And you could see in, for example, that now infamous signal exchange that was exposed by Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic, the absolute disdain with which senior officials, including J.D. Vance, Pete Hegseth and others, have for Europeans. There's just no question about this. And for Europeans, I think the lesson is one that has to be absorbed. And that is that, as you said rightly, Chris, we're on our own. Since 1949, the United States has provided the security blanket for Europe. I think that is over. And it poses really deep questions about whether the Europeans can get their act together and can substitute a purely European force, which I hope will include the United Kingdom and may even include Canada, as a substitute for NATO in the years ahead. Now, you may be aware that the European Council has done some extraordinary things in recent weeks. It's announced a Rearm Europe program, and that could potentially see up to 800 billion euros a year of new spending and new investment in defense and security. There are different elements to it. The most important part, I think, is the borrowing at European level, that the European Commission would borrow on behalf of the collective European Union, and the EU would effectively take over as the main security guarantor for all European states. I think that's the direction which we're heading. That's the whole rationale behind the meeting in Paris today. There'll be other such summits in Brussels and elsewhere in the months to come. But we should be in no doubt that Putin and Trump are absolutely aligned, and not just on Ukraine. They want to, both of them, colonize Ukraine. And in Trump's case, that's being repeated literally every day of the week. On Monday of this week, for example, he talked about taking over Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear plant in Europe. He talks forever about the alleged large quantities of rare earth minerals that Ukraine has. Everything that he and his acolytes have done suggests to me that they are out of Europe. So it's not just about Ukraine. We are probably going to see the entire withdrawal of American troops from the European continent. I was in the Baltic states only about 5 weeks ago, and I visited all three capitals in the space of a week. The tension there is absolutely palpable, because they know Russia, they understand it from their own historical experiences, and that's why they are rearming at a much more rapid rate than countries in Western Europe are.
Yeah, I mean, it's terrible, but could we see a situation where basically Trump and Putin are talking to each other and saying, okay, Vlad, you take Ukraine, you take the Baltic states, and if you want Poland as well and Moldova, that's fine, and we'll look the other way if there's anything going on in Georgia and you want to go there. Meanwhile, I've been looking at the map, and it'll look a lot better if I've got Canada and Greenland. That takes me all the way from the Mexican border all the way to basically your border, and we basically carve that up between the two of us. I mean, are we looking at that scenario?
Well, it's really
in Panama as well, which he's mentioned.
Yeah, and Panama as well, and then he might, I mean, he'd probably love to take all of Central America and control all of that. You know, one thing at a time. But if you look at the map and he takes Canada and Greenland, that's a huge chunk of landmass. And he might just do that. He might want to do that. He certainly wants to take Greenland.
I mean, it's this is where it gets really difficult, because obviously Canada, the head of state in Canada is actually King Charles, and Canada is, you know, at arm's length, but effectively is part of the United Kingdom in that way. Greenland is a long way from Denmark, but is actually maybe at arm's length, but again is part of Denmark. So we seem to be moving into an era where strong men are running countries and just decide that they rather fancy having bits of other countries. I mean, it may not be the whole of Panama that he wants. It might just be the canal. But, you know, he's got his eye on it because he's been saying that. And then all this nonsense with that really peculiar video that he posted as well with the Gaza Riviera. And I'm just going to ethnically cleanse all of Gaza and shove everybody out into Jordan and Egypt. They can look after them. So it's not just his attitude about Europe that I think we need to be looking at. It's his attitude about, if I want it, and if it should be something that America needs and wants, then I might just take it. Now, at the moment, we haven't seen him going to war to actually take anything yet. But, you know, he's been putting that out there now since he was re-elected pretty clearly. The whole thing about NATO follows on from the way that, you know, the relationship with the UN and the WHO, the United Nations and the World Health Organization last time, which was pretty rocky, and this time he's gone straight in and is very dismissive of them. So it's a lot of international bodies that America is, if you like, I mean, I can't think of another word other than thumbing their nose at all these bodies. And it's just America first. Now, you know, that was his slogan last time. That is his slogan for this campaign. The relationship with Russia seems to me to be one where my enemy's enemy is my friend, which I think is a fundamental misunderstanding by the Americans of Russia's relationship with China, because they keep saying, this is J.D. Vance and some of the others are saying, China is the real threat. We need to worry about China. And if they cannot see that the Russians, the Belarusians, the North Koreans and the Chinese and the Iranians already have a strong relationship, which emerges every now and again into the light of day, but also sometimes is more under the surface. I think they are grossly mistaken to think that Russia wants to be America's friend. Russia must be laughing at the moment about the way they're moving over Ukraine.
Very true, Leonie, what you say there, that there is an axis and it is those four countries and they do work together. Nigel, I mean, it's a strange situation that we've got in Washington. Is he running the country like a fascist dictator, or is he running the country like a mafia don? And when was the last time we saw any mention of the Senate, the House, Congress, or even to some extent the Supreme Court? Because you're dealing here with a president that seems to sit behind the desk and just sign executive orders, 100 it's up to now since he took over. None of this is debated anywhere. He's running it like he's a mafia don or a fascist dictator, one of the two. Which one is it?
Well, I mean, it's a bit of everything. The difference now with Trump in his second term is he's in control of the House, the Senate, and the Supreme Court. That makes life difficult. As far as the situation with Ukraine goes, I think before we actually talk about Trump taking troops out of Europe or trying to abandon NATO completely, we take things step by step. Where we are at the moment is that America can no longer be relied on as an ally. We don't know whether America would come to our aid should Russia decide to push into Europe. But then again, equally, Europe has been complacent ever since 1949. So Trump is right in the sense that Europe should actually do more to look after itself, rather than thinking that America would automatically pile in should it be under threat. So that's kind of where we are at the moment. That's where we are with our defence spending and dealing with those problems. Then we start looking at Ukraine. So there is obviously a huge difference between us and America. We're talking about putting a peacekeeping force into Ukraine. That could be made up of European countries. It may be Canada, Australia and New Zealand might even send troops. The problem we've got there is, what will Russia end up accepting to end this war? Yeah. There is going to be an issue over whether or not NATO troops can actually be right on their doorstep. And that relies on us trying to think a bit more how things look from Moscow. We see NATO as a rather benign, cuddly defense alliance. Where Moscow sees it is something that is hostile and offensive. And if you just look at the way the borders have changed, that when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, NATO shared 130 miles of border with Russia. Now it's 1,500 miles. If Ukraine was to join NATO, as it should be its right as a sovereign nation, that would add an extra 1,200 miles. So you can see from Russia's point of view that they can feel threatened. And that's the kind of balance we're going to have to strike if a deal is going to be done.
But what does that deal look like? Because for sure, there's a snowball in hell's chance of the Ukraine joining NATO. Putin will never, ever, ever go for that. And that shouldn't even be on the table in terms of negotiation. And you say they're a sovereign nation. They should be able to join NATO if they want to and if they're allowed to. But for sure, Putin's never going to accept that. He's not going to give up the Crimea. He's probably not going to give up the land that he's taken on the east of the Ukraine anyway. And he probably even wants more than that. So where is there a deal here that can be struck? Get the war over in 24 hours, get the war over in 24 years, more likely at this point.
I agree with you, Chris, that I don't think that Ukraine will join NATO. The best we could hope for there is some kind of fudge. So you don't take away their right to join NATO. What you do is you just kick that down the road and leave it in the long grass.
Well, can I come back in here to say first, Russia has not the slightest interest in peace. What Putin wants is Ukraine. He wants to devour all of it. So we need absolute clarity. Second, in response to Nigel's point about NATO expansion, this is my specialist area. I've spent 25 years of my life, the last 25 years, working in Central and Eastern Europe. When Russia talks about NATO expansion as a problem, it's a lie. It's an absolute and fundamental lie. The Russians were never worried about NATO expansion. And by the way, the only time NATO has ever gone to war in Europe since 1949 was in 1999, when Tony Blair quite rightly led the charge against Serbian genocide that was being conducted in the countryside in Kosovo. In the same period of time, the Russians attacked East Germany in 1953. They attacked Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968. They're allies, all of them. And why? Because those countries were on the verge of moving towards a different kind of model or wanted pluralism and democracy. The Russians don't want that. And in my view, we shouldn't care what they want. Russia is a middle-ranking power and not a great power. It has a very small and shrinking economy, terrible demographics. Our only task in Europe, I think, is to create a cordon sanitaire from northern Finland down to the Bulgarian-Turkish border to make sure that Russian pathologies cannot impact on the European continent. So I can see this year, Europe stepping in financially and militarily to support Ukraine. And it's absolutely vital that Ukraine survives as a state and that they manage to expel the Russian invaders and that we have justice at the end of that. Now, there is no sign at the moment that these talks in Saudi Arabia are going to deliver that. They're simply not. The Russians are playing Trump. And they're playing at being interested in peace. They have no desire for peace whatsoever. And that's why we need absolute clarity about who we are dealing with and what we are dealing with. It is a poisonous, tyrannical regime that has to be defeated, and nothing else should enter into our consideration.
Okay, John, I mean, I understand what you're saying, and I basically completely agree with you. In terms of what you're saying, where does that line from Finland down to the Black Sea, where does it cross the Ukraine?
It's absolutely clear. Ukraine has got to return to the territorial integrity that it enjoyed before the first of the Russian invasions in 2014. We have to go back to the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, which guaranteed Ukraine's sovereign territory, and that agreement was guaranteed by the United States and the United Kingdom. The Ukrainians gave up their nuclear weapon. Russia infringed that agreement, as it has broken almost every single other agreement that it had in place with post-Soviet countries, whether Georgia, Moldova, or other countries. This is a cancer in our midst, Chris, and we have to recognize that. And any of our actions that follow from this should be about that. And I think one of the most important changes we're seeing here is the change in leadership in Germany. Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor designate in Germany, is going to be a hugely important figure, I think. Generations of German leaders, both SPD and CDU, fooled themselves into believing that Russia could be part of European civilization. It can't. It has to sit outside until it learns how to behave like a civilized state.
So you're going to kick Russia out of Crimea as well as out of the east of the Ukraine, and Ukraine is going to be specifically on the western part of this divide between Russia and Europe.
If France had invaded Cornwall, would people be sitting around in conversations like this saying, oh, we must negotiate with the French, and that may mean giving up Cornwall? Of course not. We summon the spirit of Churchill and others and fight for all of the right values of democracy, of pluralism, and territorial integrity.
What, John, if half the people in Cornwall were French-speaking rather than English-speaking? Would that make any difference?
With respect, it's a bullshit argument, Chris. I'm really sorry to put it like that. Most people in Ireland speak English, and guess what? We are resolutely Irish.
Okay.
That's a canard that comes out of the Kremlin. And by the way, since the second invasion in 2022, we've seen literally the forging of the Ukrainian nation. Putin has done more to actually create the new Ukrainian nation than any Ukrainian could ever have hoped to do. And in those occupied regions and all of the areas that are often mentioned, support for Ukraine is often as strong in people whose first language is Russian nowadays as it is Ukrainian. So it's a complete canard, and it should have nothing to do with any kind of settlement in my...
And the same in the case of, is it Latvia, one of the Baltic states, where it's almost 50% Russian speaking, and you'd say the same thing there as well then?
Absolutely. And again, having visited all those states recently, yes, there are significant minorities that speak Russian, but they are increasingly integrated into Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian society. And they understand very well the difference between how people live a normal life within European Union countries compared to Russia. And the real issue for Putin, to go back to Nigel's point about NATO expansion, it was never that. It was always EU enlargement. Just to give you one example, in 1991, coming out of communism, Ukraine and Poland had exactly the same standard of living. Before the invasion in 2022, the Polish standard of living was almost 5 times that of Ukraine.
Yeah.
That's the difference living in a democracy and a normal market economy makes. You can't do
being
that
part of
with
the EU, because Poland's benefited enormously from being part of the EU.
Absolutely. Poland is going to become a hugely important state in the near future, both economically, and it's going to have probably the largest army in Europe as well in the years to come. It's a huge success story.
But does that mean, John, that there is no negotiated settlement to the Ukraine war?
None. The only settlement that I see is one where Putin is completely defeated.
Which means that you're talking about us going to war with Russia.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that the Europeans must step in and support Ukraine to the maximum ability possible. Trump keeps lying when he says the United States has given Ukraine $350 billion. It's nothing like that. It's given Ukraine about $120 billion, and most of that actually went to defense contractors in the US. The Europeans have actually given, including the United Kingdom, significantly more than that. So we don't have to do that much more to continue supporting Ukraine, but that should be the key objective for me.
But Nigel's right insofar as all that's achieved is to almost sort of hold the line. It hasn't made any progress in winning anything back. We haven't even addressed the situation with the Crimea that you think should be brought back to be part of Ukraine as it was prior to 2014. Only way, Nigel must be right in saying the only way you're going to achieve this is if we, as whether it's we part of Europe or whatever form that might be, goes to war with Russia to kick them out of the lands that you want them kicked out.
Firstly, Ukraine has already degraded Russia's military and security capacity by about 70%. That's an astonishing figure. If we look at the figures for casualties, the Russians have lost almost 900,000. Remember, the invading army in 2022 was 150,000. Now, that 900,000 figure is composed of about 200,000 dead soldiers and about 700,000 injured. If we go back to the 90s, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan on Christmas Day 1979. They lost 15,000 soldiers dead, 35,000 injured. So already we're talking about 20 times that number of casualties in a third of the period of time. It's just extraordinary what has happened. And the Ukrainians did that with the support of the United Kingdom, the Europeans, and the United States. But their resistance and their valor has been extraordinary, and we don't acknowledge that enough. They are literally fighting for their lives, and they've done an incredible job in degrading Russia's capacity to hurt the rest of Europe. The Russian Navy, for example, Chris, cannot put ships to sea around the Ukrainian coast. So successful have the Ukrainians been through drones, for example, in taking out the Russian Black Sea Fleet. That's an extraordinary achievement, and I think it needs to be acknowledged.
That could be why America and Russia are focusing now on having a ceasefire in the Black Sea and nowhere else then.
There already is a ceasefire because the Ukrainians made it impossible for the Russians to operate in the area.
So, Nigel, what do you don't see this war ending very quickly then in John's scenario, do we?
No, well, I don't see it ending at all. That's the problem.
Yes.
This is my point about whether or not we work on the basis of a negotiated settlement. I take all John's points that the Russians have constantly gone back on treaties that they forged. But the alternative to me seems to be that the Ukraine war just keeps going on, that we can keep supplying them. Europe may even step up a bit more, but Ukraine doesn't actually win at the end of it. So the idea, and it's certainly from President Zelensky's point of view, it would appear that a negotiated settlement is something that he is keen on to end the war. Now, clearly, he doesn't want to give away a load of territory, but all the indications seem to me, the mood music behind the scenes is that, say, for instance, Crimea would be conceded.
To which I say, not under any circumstances. And we should, under whatever scenario might emerge, of course, listen to the Ukrainians. If they were to be able to live with that, Nigel, I'd be perfectly fine with that. But I don't see any indication that the Ukrainians actually would settle for that kind of territorial loss. It would be incredible. They'd be losing a core part of the country to military aggression.
There isn't much warfare going on.
Saying there, John, is that there is no deal to be done.
Mm.
There is no deal to be done with murderous tyrants. That's my view, absolutely.
In terms of Crimea, John, I'll bring Leonie in a second. In terms of Crimea, what's happening in Crimea right now? Are the people living there they're part of Russia and they're just getting on with their daily lives and they're not caring too much about it? No one's making a big issue over Crimea. It's almost like we've all accepted Russia will keep Crimea. That's a chip on the table.
No, Well, firstly, Russia has occupied Crimea since 2014. Remember, they sent in the troops, they lied about it, the so-called little green men. So that occupation has been going on for a long time. And amongst other things they have done is to kidnap tens of thousands of Ukrainian children and bring them to be indoctrinated as Russians in Russian territory. That's amongst the incredible war crimes committed by Putin and his forces in Ukraine over the last 10 years and especially over the last 3 years. There were referendums held, and you may recall, Chris, when that referendum was held in 2014, we had Russian soldiers in polling stations with machine guns guiding people to the ballot box. We then get Witkov, Trump's insane contact guy on Ukraine last week, completely echoing Kremlin talking points, saying there were referendums held in all these territories and people voted for Russia. The truth could not be further from that. Actually, people were coerced at the point of machine guns to opting for Ukraine. I have no doubt if referendums were held, even in Crimea, in the near future, that people would opt to be Ukrainian and not Russian.
Okay. Leonie?
I'm not actually sure how many ordinary people are left living in Crimea anymore, because it has been turned into a cross between a military installation, which has been very heavily and successfully bombed, both the fleets stationed off the coast and also some of the installations. The Ukrainians destroyed a lot of the aircraft that were parked on airfields. But there was also this really, well, talking about Trump and the Riviera, they'd also made it into a sort of holiday destination for Russians to go and enjoy themselves. Now, of course, they were all kind of on their beach towels when the war broke out in February. So there was a sort of mass exit, and I don't think it's been used as a holiday destination very much since then. So if you happen to have your dacha in Crimea, that was probably a bit of an error of judgment, and you might want to rebuild it somewhere else in Russia. And then, of course, the Ukrainians managed to successfully bomb the bridge that the Russians had constructed over the Sea of Azov. So I think it's still very contested. I'm not sure that we can say that it's something that the Ukrainians are happy to give up and that the Russians now have a complete hold on. You know, the situation in the Black Sea, in other parts of the Black Sea, you know, they wouldn't keep bombing Odessa. They wouldn't keep trying to stop the Ukrainians if the whole thing had been settled in some way. So I think that's completely not settled. I think the issue is, if you look at the history of the relationship with the Soviet Union before, with its sort of satellites that it partly wanted to see as being part of the Soviet sphere of influence, part of the wider Soviet Union, they did in the end have to pull back from their various invasions of, you know, the Prague Spring and things like that. And if you look at what the first invasion of Ukraine, where they did actually use Belarus as a jumping off point, they actually had to withdraw quite a lot of the troops because they just weren't in a fit state to go ahead and take Kyiv, which was part of their original plan. So the question is can they carry on? And I think John is quite right to say, how are the Russians doing here? I take Nigel's point about, you know, could this turn into a forever war? This, you know, not, are we seeing 1984 and Oceania and Eurasia fighting forever, and then, you know, people sort of switching sides? And it does feel a bit like that with the way the Americans are behaving towards the Russians. So George Orwell clearly could read the future. But I do think that they are in a more desperate situation. Why otherwise would they have done the deal with North Korea to end up with North Korean troops, who I think, as far as I could figure out, seem to have been slaughtered en masse because they've gone in there with very little training. I'm not even sure they've had the right equipment for the weather when they were sort of dumped into the areas where they were being expected to fight. So they wouldn't have been bringing in North Korean troops if they weren't becoming desperate. So, I mean, I think Zelensky was joking about this. And by the way, of course, his first language is Russian, you know, because he comes from that part of Ukraine where Russian was, you know, the first language of most people and therefore of his own. But he is quite clearly, you know, a very strong Ukrainian, you know, nationalist and leader. But he was joking yesterday on the Champs-Élysées saying, of course, you know, Putin is old, and quite a lot of us are young. Eventually, he's I don't know when Putin's going to die, but clearly, so that could be. But I mean, that will be potentially could be in 10 years' time.
Yeah.
I think the election of Donald Tusk in Poland is really interesting, as well as the change of leadership to Merz in Germany that John was referring to. And I think things are changing. I mean, at the moment, it does seem also that Macron has been coming forward with a very strong position on all of this. So I think the development of the coalition of the willing, or whatever I think they've been calling it, it is very interesting. I think there are major changes taking place in the relationships between the various different countries in
Yeah.
Europe. And that has partly been driven by changes in the relationship with America, but I don't think it's just down to that. I think there have been some changes, and I think the economic development of the Baltic states that John was also referring to, the economic development of Poland, which is and electing a new leadership there, and the changes in Germany. I think these are all very interesting developments, some of which I think would have been happening in any case.
Yeah, it's interesting, and interesting what you say about the leaders and the age of the leaders of what, let's call them the Axis states. And in fact, I was at a speech that Niall Ferguson was making the other day, where he made the point that of the 4 Axis states, being Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, only one of them had a succession plan for when the leader goes. What happens in the other places, i.e. China, Russia, and Iran, when the leader goes, that's a huge problem. Let's say it isn't going to happen. Why are we even talking about it? But we could have said that about a lot of things 3 months ago, which have happened. I don't think the United States is going to invade Canada, but they could easily invade Greenland. They're not going to get what they want by any other means. They're not going to get it by Denmark saying, you know what, you can have Greenland, we don't care. They're not going to get it in a referendum. They want control of Greenland. They could easily invade it. That really would be like a 24-hour war. What happens if they do that? Or are you going to say, Chris, ain't going to happen, don't even think about it?
I mean, all these things could happen. I mean, for all we know, that aliens from out of space may land in the next month. So there are all sorts of coulds. But I think we've got to sort of gauge Donald Trump. He says a lot of things. It doesn't necessarily mean he ends up doing them. So he talks about a 51st state of Canada. Do we seriously think that's going to happen? Personally, no, I don't. Invading Greenland, yes, he could do it, but it would be a major step. What do you think his methods of negotiating seem to be to actually use words as a sledgehammer? So by threatening Europe, by threatening NATO, by threatening to take America out of it, he had already achieved one thing, which is to get all European countries to increase their defence spending, no matter what problems that causes each country, as we're seeing here. So I just think that when Trump says things, it's often to get a result, not necessarily because he's going to carry it out and head us all towards Armageddon.
I agree. He did say, let's build a wall between America and Mexico. And he said that when he was president number 45, and he didn't build the wall.
Well,
and
he built part of it, and he's trying to build more of it.
But he didn't build a wall, and actually Biden built some of that as well. So it wasn't just Trump. So he does say a lot of things that he then doesn't follow through on. Can we really see him creating the Riviera in Gaza? Can we see thousands of American paratroopers all being landed in Gaza to herd Palestinians out of the rubble and then create this beach resort? I mean, I do think some of these things are much less likely. I'm not sure whether they're more or less likely than aliens arriving. I'm going to leave that judgment to Nigel, as he's introduced the aliens into the subject.
But we should acknowledge, I think, that Trump 2.0 is a very different beast to the first administration. He is surrounded now by sycophants and lunatics that indulge his narcissism. And I think that's one of the reasons he's been emboldened to keep saying the kind of crazy things that he's been saying about Greenland and elsewhere. In a way, it reflects Steve Bannon's maxim that what you've got to do is flood the zone with shit. That's literally what they do with the information space, and Trump's pronouncements are really useful from deflecting from what they're really doing in the United States. For example, yesterday in Boston, Tufts University, an elite university in Boston, a young woman was arrested, taken off the streets, and literally disappeared, as it turns out, to Louisiana without any warrant, without any legal process. And this has been happening over and over again in recent weeks. Now, this is a Turkish PhD student, as it turned out, and her crime was writing an opinion piece in the Tufts University newspaper that was opposed to the policies of Israel in Gaza. Now, to me, this is really, really the more important focus, where it should lie, because it's absolutely chilling. In my own case, I was supposed to go to a conference in Philadelphia in May, and I've decided not to go because the risk of arrest is now really, really heightened. We saw a French academic being arrested a week ago in the US on arrival because when they searched his phone, he had said mildly critical things. Well, if you're a long-term critic of the Trump mafia gang, it's very likely you're going to end up in prison. And that's going to be, I think, terribly damaging to the reputation of the United States. But the bigger issue is the degradation of the Constitution and the rule of law that's attached to this Trump 2.0 administration.
It is frightening. That was the French academic was going to a conference in Houston. And I do think that it is now very dangerous for anybody going to America. You need to check your mobile phones. You need to check whatever messages you're putting out to people, anything on Twitter or X or whatever, because it could happen to anybody. And it's a very scary thing. And we're living in the world now of strong men. And you've got another strong man in Turkey. What's going to happen there, John? Is he clinging to power? Is he popular? Is the mayor of Istanbul, does he deserve to be in jail? And how's this one going to pan out?
Of course not. The reason the mayor of Istanbul is in jail is because he represents a real and significant challenge to Erdogan's authority. Erdogan has been in power now since the early 2000s. Like a lot of people in that position, he acts with complete impunity. He has the same strongman authoritarian impulses that run through Trump and run through Putin and Modi and so many others. But for me, the interesting thing, Chris, about what happened in Turkey was the change in public opinion. There were huge protests, not just in Istanbul and Ankara, but in cities and towns in the Anatolian heartland, which is where the AK party, Erdogan's party, draws its core support from. And I think the danger to his authority is much more pronounced now than the last time we had very significant protests, which was during the Gezi Park affair in Istanbul, which was more than a decade ago. Erdogan has survived a lot of things in office. I think he is more unpopular now than he has ever been. And what it also points to, I think, is a bit of hope, where we've been surveying this really dystopian global landscape, because those protests in Turkey were accompanied more or less at the same time a couple of weeks ago by the largest protest we've ever seen in Serbia since the fall of Milosevic on the 5th of October 2000. Why? Because they have another kleptocratic authoritarian regime that's doing a lot of the same things as Erdogan's is. In Budapest, the same weekend, we had hundreds of thousands of people protesting Orban. So there is hope, I think, in people power and in ordinary people who reach a point where they say enough is enough. We have to return to some form of pluralism and democracy. Really interesting question is, will that happen in the United States? That I'm not so sure about.
Well, I mean, my next question, Nigel, Leonie, I mean, talking about that, we're living in the world of strong men dictators. The United States voted for it. They seem to be going along with it. Is there any place in the modern world for a liberal elected democratic regime like we have in the UK? Are we going to be clamouring that we want Nigel Farage or Rupert Lowe or whoever to be our version of Modi or Erdogan or Trump or whatever? Do we feel that in order to stand up to these people in the rest of the world, that we cannot any longer be a democracy where we have a vote in a House of Parliament where people can say, you know what, I disagree with what the government's doing here?
Well, fortunately, we do still have a vote. I mean, I appreciate that we've seen the rise of right-wing populist parties, AfD in Germany, and certainly Reform here. I'm not convinced that Reform will be with us for the long term anyway. I mean, you just have to look at what happened to the SDP back in the 1980s, and they were running in the polls at about the same that Reform is now. A, we have an electoral system which is unkind to smaller parties, and B, the parties themselves have a habit of falling out. That's what happened to the SDP. It seems to be happening to Reform. They may make it to the next election. Whether they actually make a huge electoral gains, I don't know. And the final point about America, having lived there for 5 years, I think the Americans also respect democracy. They respect the fact that Donald Trump has been democratically elected. However, there's only a certain amount that Americans are going to put up with. And if Trump becomes too authoritarian and dictatorial, I don't think the Americans would take that lying down.
Well, we might see what happens in 3.5 years' time or whenever the next election is, as to whether he finds a way of running again when the Constitution says he can't. And do we really think that Donald Trump is the kind of person that's going to say, okay, my time's up, hope I've done a good job, I'm going off to play golf in Mar-a-Lago, good luck to my successor?
No, he's completely not that kind of guy, but it is very embedded into the American Constitution and the two-term limit. So it would be quite a dramatic shift in the States to push that through. I appreciate that at the moment he controls both the House of Representatives, the Senate, and he's also got the majority in the Supreme Court. But, there have been judges already challenging some of the things that he's been doing. I think that's going to start to develop more and more. I think there are Republican representatives and senators who've already become alarmed at some of the cuts that are being pushed through by Musk and this DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, because and the cuts to some of the budgets they realized might affect their states where they've been voting Republican. If there are swinging cuts to education budgets or health budgets, because there are quite a few people in America with health issues who do rely on, I can never remember which one, in Medicare or Medicaid, but people do rely on these things. So I think if those cuts start to come through, and people start to see the local impacts, and of course all this tariff might be a beautiful word, but the disruption on Wall Street, and people do put a lot of money into stocks and shares in the States. If people start losing money, they're not going to be happy about that. And if their grocery bills don't come down, which the Republicans quite rightly focused on in the election, and the Democrats unfortunately didn't, they were talking about all kinds of other stuff, and I think they made a mistake there. But I think if the economy starts to tank in America, I think all of that could lead to midterm elections, which would then tie his hands, because he won't have the trifecta that he does at the moment, the three sections that he controls. And I think it's quite difficult to see him being allowed to change the Constitution. But never, he is completely unpredictable, and American politics is pretty unpredictable. So I can.
And we just got to look and see what happened January 6th, 4 years ago. You wouldn't have expected that to have happened either. And sure, the midterm elections are going to be an important barometer for what the situation is and how the American public do take it. And we don't know the effect of the tariffs. I mean, Americans are thinking, great, he's looking after our interests. It might not be that case. But I think the worrying thing is that when John's talking about thinking that maybe he will not go to America when he's scheduled to go because of the dangers that could happen. And it is people, whether it's just normal people on the street, whether it's people in Congress, not wanting to come out and oppose anything that's emanating out of the White House for fear of reprisal. And that's basically what happened in many times in the past in situations where the world has got into a real mess.
And by the way, Chris, Elon Musk is actively going around Congress and saying to Republican members that might be inclined to oppose Trump, I will primary you, meaning I will throw all of my financial weight behind your potential opponents in the primary campaign, and we will unseat you. All of that, I think, is having a terribly chilling effect. And it means, in effect, that the Republican Party has ceased to be a functioning political party, and it is now much more akin to a cult than anything we might know from politics.
Oh, yeah, it's no longer the Republican Party that we know. Is it?
No, absolutely not. And
No.
we were able to tell that it was going in that direction when he was last the president, and during the time of the Biden administration, and now with Trump coming back. I mean, he failed to show up to John McCain's funeral, which I thought was just so rude. I mean, that's just so disrespectful. It's just unbelievable the way that he's so disrespectful to people who are indeed Republican. And then if you're not Republican, I mean, what he's been saying about the journalist who, for some reason, they added him to that chat, and his number must have already been in Hegseth's phone, because you can't add somebody's number to a Signal, a Telegram, or a WhatsApp group unless you've already got their number in your phone.
Yeah.
So, it was Hegseth who did it, and I think has actually admitted that he did it. And they've been so rude about the journalist and also the organisation that he, the Atlantic, his particular outlet. He's a very thin-skinned president, as Nigel said. So he can hand it out, but he hands it out all over the place. But he can't take it back.
We didn't get around to talking about that.
No.
But one of the participants was in Moscow at the time. Normally, in situations like this, you're not allowed to take your mobile phone with you when you go places like that. And so the participant in Moscow, obviously, the KGB and the whatever heard every part of that conversation. And if they're having a chat line for the Yemeni position, then they're probably having chat lines on other things as well. And God knows what. Oh my God, it's scary. Nigel, can you give us something to look forward to? Give us some confidence in where we're at before we say goodbye.
Okay, the one optimistic thing I think about America is it still has a free press. A lot of that press is actually anti-Trump. He doesn't like it, but it'd be very difficult to muzzle that media. So I think that if we've got any hope in America for the future, it is through that.
Thank you. We need just that little bit.
And we do have the Grand National to look forward to at the end of next week. So there's lots to look forward to, right?
Well, you can look forward to it, John, because I'm sure that's going to be going back to Ireland with one of the Irish runners. That's assuming there's any English runners left in the race.
Exactly.
John doesn't like that. Anyway, we'll finish with Nigel's positive comments about American democracy and the free press, and John's positive comments about the Irish chances of winning the Grand National. You've been listening to Right on the Nail with me, Chris Wright. Thank you very much to Nigel Nelson, Leonie Cooper and John O'Brennan for joining me. Having surveyed the international political landscape today, make sure to join us again next week for a very special episode focused on the UK's Reform Party. This podcast is produced by Tom Platts at soundsapien.com. So thanks for listening. Catch you next time on Right on the Nail.